Okay, Joe Coates, former Chief Executive of England Netball and UK Athletics. Thanks so much for joining us here in the SportsPro studio at SportsPro Live. How are you? How are you enjoying the day so far? Having a good time?
Yeah, no, it's really good. Yeah, really good. Very easy journey down here, which was nice. And it's so busy. When I first did the walkthrough, I was like, wow, there are a lot of people here. So, no, all good, thank you. Very nice to be here.
Great, perfect. Well, yeah, thanks so much for being with us. We're here to talk about leadership and, leading organisations, something that you've got a lot of experience of doing in your time in the sports industry. But before we get into kind of like the specifics of your time at England Netball, at UK Athletics, just kind of keen to take a little bit of a trip down memory lane, if that's all right. If you could sort of cast your mind back a little bit, I suppose, just would love to kind of hear a little bit about, when you were growing up, was when you were thinking about a career for yourself, was the sports industry always one that you thought about going into, one that you kind of identified as where you could see yourself being?
It actually wasn't, no. I was fascinated by fashion when I was young. So I actually left school at 16. Again, didn't go to university, so when I do quite a few talks with young people, I'm always like, you don't always have to go to university. And I actually came down to London to train to be a fashion buyer when I was 16. Couldn't afford to stay here, so went back home. But that was always my dream, to actually work in fashion. I only really wanted to work in sport after I'd had my second child, actually, my son. And I was working in the commercial side of all different sorts of industries, and I just thought, do you know what, sport does something for young people. It's an amazing environment for young people to thrive, and I just thought, I'm going to look for a job in sport, and it was my children that made me make that decision. Never made it in fashion, unfortunately.
So what was your first job in sport, do you remember?
So my first role in sport was to work for MPIX, the sports photography agency. So they were Nottingham based, because again, I'd got young children, I needed something that was local to me. And they were looking for a commercial manager to go in and basically take over the commercial team. And I got some commercial and marketing experience, so that was my very first job. And at the time, run by a fantastic guy called Phil O'Brien. And they mainly delivered images to the editorial industry, so they didn't really go after the commercial market. And I helped them raise their profile in the commercial market, which enabled me to work on Champions League. I worked on that for 3 years, worked on Lloyd's TSB 5 Nations, as it was then. I'm very, very old. Nat West with cricket, so got a really great experience across all sides of sport, really.
Mm-hmm, sure. And did you play sport growing up, out of curiosity?
I was a keen sports person. I was actually quite a good sprinter, but I wasn't brilliant by any stretch of the imagination. But I was fascinated by it. I used to read like the back pages of newspapers when my friends would never do that, So I was always fascinated by the world of sport.
Yeah, would you say that leadership was something that kind of, did you always sort of see yourself becoming a leader at an organisation, irrespective of what industry you saw yourself ending up in? Was it kind of, I want to be the CEO one day, or do your ambitions sort of evolve as you learn more about yourself as an individual and you kind of change as a person?
Yeah, I always wanted it. I always wanted to either be a CEO of a business or run my own business. And when I very first left fashion college and I couldn't stay in London to be a fashion buyer, I actually set up my own business then, making clothes and selling them on party plans. So it was something I'd always wanted to do. I'm not very good at being told what to do. I'm not very good. One of my senior managers when I was young kind of said, you're a little bit unmanageable. And I think I was, because I always wanted to strive to make something better. And I felt the only way to do that was actually to lead an organisation. So it maybe could have been in anything, really. But yeah, my dream was always to run an organisation or own my own business.
Yeah, is that kind of, I suppose, sort of being able to control the outcome a little bit more rather than sort of leaving it in the hands of someone else? I suppose that when you speak to a lot of leaders, that's why they do it, isn't it? And that they kind of have control over the destiny a little bit more. They're sort of the one taking responsibility. Is that kind of something that makes you take benefit?
Very much so, yeah. I'm one of those people that if I'm sat in a meeting and someone else is chairing it and it's not moving on, I can feel my frustration levels rising. And yeah, it's that. I think it's the control of being able to influence the direction of a business. Most definitely, it's that. I also love being able to recruit amazing people, and the culture of recruitment and the type of people you recruit for an organisation. When you lead that organisation, you really can see that flow through. I love that side of it. And I do love the pressure of the accountability. I don't mind being the person who gets into bother if things go wrong. I really do enjoy that part of it.
Sure. Was leadership something that always you felt came quite naturally to you then? Like even in various environments as you were growing up, maybe did you find that you were putting yourself in positions? I'm trying to think of examples. Maybe we spoke about sport as one, sort of playing sport as one where you could naturally kind of take a lead, but also I suppose even in sort of groups at school and that kind of thing, you're kind of the one sort of leading the conversation. Was it sort of something that came quite naturally?
I maybe didn't identify it in myself when I was young. I don't think I saw it because I played team sport, but I was never the captain. Quite often you hear leaders go, yeah, I was the captain of the team and I was head girl and all the rest of it. I was never that person, but I was always somebody that I think people, and I'm only saying this because friends that I've met up with afterwards, they were like, yeah, but at school you were always the one that everybody wanted to be with, or they wanted to follow you. And I don't think I saw it. I don't think I naturally saw that in myself. So I probably didn't go through the traditional route of being captain of everything, but I think people kind of gravitated to me is probably the way that I would vocalise it, I suppose.
Yeah, sure. What would you sort of describe your leadership style as then? Would you be, you're talking about people gravitating to you. I imagine it's kind of a, more of a people first approach rather than being, say, a little bit more hands off. What would you sort of say your leadership style was once you eventually got into those sort of CEO roles?
I think it's a question I've been asked a few times about what's my leadership style, and I've heard other people explain their leadership styles who I've looked at and thought, I'm not sure you were that great a leader. So I've actually asked other people what they see in me that makes me a good leader. The first thing that most people say is I will make decisions quickly and I will stick to them. And I think, again, when people work in an organisation, they want to see that. They don't want to see people pontificate over things. They want their leader to make decisions and stick by them. I'm definitely a people person. I like to get to know the people that work with me. I like them to know what kind of leader I am and what my expectation levels are. I think that's really, really important to me. I think as well, setting a really clear direction for an organisation so that everybody really understands what part do I play in this. I think that's so important for any leader. If you can be that outward-facing person, which is great, and a lot of my career I've had to be that, but you have to be that inward-facing person as well, that people understand exactly what it is that you're asking them to do and how you measure success. I think that's really important if you want to lead a team of people. And another word that has been used against me, and as a woman I probably shouldn't say this because then they'll all go, oh, she's vile, but ruthless. I think I can be quite ruthless at times. A CEO's job, a lot of it is managing the risk around an organisation and what happens if you take a risky decision. I will take quite risky decisions if it's in the best interest of the organisation that I work for, and I think then people quite often class me as ruthless.
Right, yeah, it's interesting you say that because I suppose the last few years a lot of people in leadership positions across various organisations in lots of different industries will have had to make ruthless decisions because of COVID and the impacts after that, whether it be layoffs, restructuring, cost cutting, etc. I was going to ask you, were there any parts of being CEO that you found uncomfortable or perhaps didn't like, and I suppose those difficult decisions can be part of it, but it sounds like maybe it was the opposite. You were ready to make those decisions, which I suppose is maybe something that being a good leader you need to be able to do.
Yeah, I think I was always ready to make decisions. I've done a couple of restructures and they're not pleasant. I don't like doing it, but I understand that is my role within the organisation to do it. So I don't feel uncomfortable when I do it, and I'm not ridden with guilt afterwards. But one thing I would say is that I think I've always communicated the rationale as to why something would be restructured. And certainly people that have been with organisations for a long time, if you've had to move them out of the organisation, I would do it myself. I would never put that on somebody else that might be uncomfortable doing it. I would have that conversation. So I don't think there's ever been a time where I've felt uncomfortable making decisions, because I think that's what I was paid to do.
Yeah.
But I haven't always enjoyed the decisions I've had to make.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And let's talk a little bit about some of the roles you've held in the sport now. So we'll start with obviously England Netball. why don't we just sort of start with how you kind of came to be involved in that organisation, I guess, because it wasn't straight into the CEO, was it? You were there for a few years before eventually taking that on.
Yeah, so I've been commercial director at the football conference, so people kind of forget, I think, that I started after sports photography. I started in male semi-professional football, and I loved my time there. It was fantastic, and I actually got asked to sit on the panel that originally formed the WSL, so what is now the Women's Super League. I was one of the original people on the panel that chose the clubs, etc., back in 2009, 2010. And one of the other ladies on that panel actually said, Netball are looking for somebody to go in and shake it up a bit. They're just about recruiting for a commercial and marketing director. And I was like, that sounds really interesting. So I went, was interviewed and got the role. So it was actually because of my relationship with football that I ended up in netball. So I started there as commercial and marketing director. And it was a dream for somebody like me that likes to go in and make change and try to make something different. I very quickly realised that this was a little gem, a gem that people had worked really hard to take somewhere, but it was the time that you could do something very special with the sport across all aspects of it. So, yeah, it was a defining moment, I think, in my career to get that role.
Yeah. And what do you kind of remember about that organisation when you went in? Because I suppose it must have looked a lot different to how it does now. What are sort of some of the first sort of impressions that you had when you went in?
Fantastic at creating participation programs and getting women and girls to play the sport, but not great at then telling the world how good they were at doing that and actually selling their products, if you like. So they were brilliant at creating product, but not great at selling product. So participation was really, really good. Probably the semi-professional side of the league, and then as we renamed them, the Roses, which that was a battle, but the England team were not really performing. So the big battle was to change the actual performance environment, and that's really what we spent a long time doing, and really rebranding the sport and taking the sport to a new audience to sell women's sport. So it was very different. Yeah, when we started, I remember actually in my interview, I just said it's white middle class navy blue knickers. They still gave me the job, and that's really what we wanted to change. And when we signed Nike, we actually said from navy blue knickers to Nike, and that's the journey we felt we took the sport on.
Mm-hmm, sure. And as you sort of referenced there, Nike, but I mean, your time there coincided with like significant increase in sponsorship deals, success on the court as well, with the Roses winning the Commonwealth Games, winning gold at the Commonwealth Games, securing the hosting rights for the World Cup as well. Everyone would probably agree that it was sort of a period that coincided with netball becoming renowned in this country, really. What do you think were sort of some of the things that went right there, I suppose? What was it that kind of about your leadership that resonated in that organisation?
So, and people who've worked for me get me so bored of me saying this. We had a fantastic plan. Some people think that just happened. That didn't just happen. We wrote an amazing strategy for the sport which encompassed all of that. It was about participation, it was about the Super League, and it was about growing performance, and underpinning all of that was commercial return. And we built a proper plan for that. Nothing happened by accident. That was built strategically. We all know that in sport, when two teams get to a final, anything could happen. But we knew that if we recreated that performance pathway, brought the right people in, got the girls into a full-time programme, we knew we'd have a shot at winning a medal. So that was a total revamp of the performance. We knew that if we started to get the performance right, we had to have the product from a participation point, that when somebody saw it and was like, I remember doing that, I want to go back, we had programmes that they could play in. So every time we were successful on court, our participation, our membership went up, and it stayed up. We didn't have that kind of going up and dropping because we had the right programs. And then commercially, we created a great story. We rebranded the sport. We made it much more lifestyle, much more female focused, and brands loved it. And I've got to thank Vitality, because at the time, again, when we took netball as a women's sport to market, everybody was saying, yeah, we'll support women's sport. Nobody would actually put their hand in their pocket. And if you look at it now, women's football, yes, people are investing, but other sports, the brands talk a big game, but they're not spending money on women's sport. And Vitality were fantastic. They supported us. They've increased their sponsorship money going in. They've been an incredible partner. Without them, we wouldn't have had the Roses. So, yeah, it was a plan. And that plan, when I go back to recruiting great people, I had the most fantastic executive team. That executive team knew exactly what they had to deliver, and they disseminated that plan through to work programs that were minutiae detail to deliver ultimately success on court, growth of participation and commercial return.
Yeah.
So it was a proper plan.
Yeah, for sure. And it was 2019 when you ended up leaving that organisation.
Yes, October 2019 after the World Cup.
Yeah. So how do you kind of, I suppose, as someone in a role like that, and where you've at an organisation where you've achieved so much success, how do you kind of reach that decision? How do you kind of decide when it is the time to go? Because it must have been tempting to kind of stay on as well.
I think it comes down to your personality. I could have stayed on and actually probably had a couple of years of calming down a little bit, because, you know, myself and the exec team and all the staff, we'd been really successful. It's probably just in my nature that once something feels like it's fixed, it's time to go. And I was approached about I wasn't actively looking, but I did get approached and just thought maybe it is time for me to do something else. When you've hosted a World Cup in your own country as well, that's a big tick in, you know, what I'd love to do in sport, winning that gold medal. It just felt, yeah, it's probably the right time to go. If I hadn't been approached by somebody, would I have stayed? I'll never know the answer to that. I don't know whether I would have actively gone and looked. I really don't know.
Sure. So you're leaving netball. You had a brief stint at the LLDC, right?
I did. Yeah, got approached about going to basically be the chief commercial officer for the Olympic Park, and that's what excited me. It was out of kind of frontline delivery of sport. It was something very different, very unique, and it was the challenge of that I thought, yeah, go and have a go at that. But then I missed frontline delivery of sport.
Right, and then so UK Athletics come along. We've spoken comparatively, I guess, compared to England Netball, an organisation not on quite the same trajectory. Let's say you've spoken a lot about, you know, fixing things and change. Was that the appeal there when that job came up?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, everybody knew that UKA were, you know, I'll use the expression, in a little bit of a pickle. So there was the Dame Sue Street review, which was pretty negative about the sport. They were undergoing a massive safeguarding review with Christopher Quinlan. So I knew the sport was not in a great place. But again, I just felt like, you know, you could get athletics back to where it was. They've still got amazing athletes. So that was the pull for me. And I'd never worked in Olympic and Paralympic sport. That was something else I'd never done. So to run the biggest Olympic and Paralympic sport for me was a massive opportunity. And to be the first woman to do it. Again, I like being the first woman to do things. So that was a massive appeal, yeah.
Sure. And so just over about a year and a half in that role, I suppose, and then you've obviously left. You know, what was sort of, I suppose, some of the things, why do you think it didn't go quite as well there, whereas obviously it had at England Netball? What were sort of some of the factors there? Why do you think maybe your leadership style didn't quite resonate in the same way that it had at England Netball?
I think at Netball I'd had 4 or 5 years as commercial director, so even though I hadn't come from the sport had got to know me, and so I think they trusted me when I took over as CEO. I think there were a couple of things at athletics. I wasn't from the sport. I don't think you have to be from a sport to run a sport. I think it's a ridiculous thing that sports say, because I wasn't from netball, I wasn't a netballer. So maybe they didn't know me. I joined and 2 days later it was COVID, so I shut the office down, so I didn't meet my staff. I had to build every single relationship over Teams. We set up bubbles for athletes, so I couldn't go and meet the athletes. So there was a lot of that happening. But there was some, you know, people sort of say it wasn't as successful as netball, and it certainly, you know, it wasn't as successful because I didn't deliver as much because I wasn't there as long. But we did everything that Dame Sue Street asked us to do. We completely changed the governance structure there. Myself and the new team wrote the first strategy the sport had in 12 years, and we got the home countries to buy into that. That was huge for the sport. So a lot of what I went in to do really was governance reform, the first part, which is never sexy. No one wants to hear about that. And then unfortunately there were a group of people in athletics who actively worked against me and worked against me with the press, and that's quite hard to battle against, because in netball, we try to do everything to get in the press. In athletics, it was like, how do we try and stay out the press, because it's always bad news. But when you've got people actively working against you, it's really quite difficult to manage that. And I think people know the reason why I left. I left because of some safeguarding issues where I fundamentally felt very strongly and probably didn't get the support that I was necessarily looking for. And I think there comes a time in your career where you'll have a deal breaker, and safeguarding of young people and athletes is a deal breaker for me. And the day I left, I just thought, wow, I think I've thrown my career away here. But it's about something I deeply care about. So
yeah, for sure. And did you feel, we've spoken about change being one of the reasons that you went there, did you feel like there was an appetite within that organisation to change as much as you would have liked? Did you find that sort of appetite when you went there, or did you feel like you were constantly sort of fighting against the tide, swimming against the tide in a way?
I think exactly the same as netball. When you go into any sport where you recognise the sport needs a lot of change, you will have the hardcore lovers of that sport that don't want change, and then you'll have a mass of people who desperately want the change. And half of the way you make that change is to build those relationships. In netball, I got a chance to build those relationships. Because of COVID, I literally couldn't go out and build the relationships with the people who didn't want the change. So it was quite hard to do that. But I still think the majority of people in athletics, especially the athletes, were open for change of format to competition. People don't want to sit for 8 hours in a stadium now, so we were looking at sport-specific, much shorter format competition, which the athletes really wanted, broadcasters wanted. We were trying to do that through COVID. It's quite tough, but I think there was an appetite for change, yeah. And you just need the momentum of those that want to change to silence those that don't, if you really can't bring them with you.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, when you sort of read some of the headlines that have been coming out in the past few weeks, there's talk of coaches being paid late. Even today there was something about the London Marathon being in talks with the UK about sort of providing some support as well. Do you feel like it would have got to that same situation if you'd stayed in charge? Do you think you'd been able to kind of reverse that at all, or is it hard to say?
I'm never going to say it would have been in the same state, because then I'm not backing myself as a leader of an organisation. So I'm going to say I don't think it would have, but equally I would have had longer in post, and I would have known, 19 months earlier that these problems were coming down the track. I think it's very difficult when you land somewhere and there's issues if you don't have a run at trying to sort those issues, especially if they're financial, because you can't just flick a switch and create a lot of money, and running athletics events is very, very expensive. So I'm going to back myself, aren't I? I'm never going to say yes. I would have led it into exactly the same situation. I'm going to say no. I don't think it would have been in quite as bad a situation.
Sure. And obviously 18 months, I think it's about 18 months on from that period now, and you've obviously had time to reflect on it. Do you think you would have done anything differently at all, or are you sort of glad that you sort of stood by the values that you have and did leave when you did? Yeah.
The reason why I left, categorically, I don't regret that at all. Do not regret that. I regret that maybe more hasn't been done in that area. That when you leave something on principle and you leave your dream job, you want to see change. And I suppose I'm disappointed that more change hasn't happened. Do I regret some of the things I did? I regret one thing, and that was I tried to equalise distance for women in athletics. And I did that at a time when I didn't know the sport well enough, and I hadn't got out to meet the people, and it sidetracked me for a while. That was a really big mistake I made as a leader, a really big mistake, and I will kick myself forever. Regardless of what the outcome of that was, I created a storm in a sport that didn't need it, and that was a real error of mine. The other things that I did, no, I don't think I regret anything, because I think some of the things were really quite successful.
Sure. And you mentioned the press before as well, and how it was really difficult to keep athletics out of the press. I mean, an organisation like that, there is probably a bit more of a spotlight on it. But when there are so many things, as a leader, when there are so many things being written about you, is it difficult to shut those out sometimes? Is it hard not to let that affect you, or do you sort of have mechanisms, I suppose, where you sort of get used to it a little bit? What is it? How do you sort of respond to press coverage?
I think when I first started, people had warned me. I think it probably was a bit of a shock. because we'd fought so hard to get any press coverage with netball that it was a bit of a shock. But you just have to block it out. If people write negative things about you, you have to block it out. You cannot let it irritate you, because most of the time you don't have an opportunity to actually say what is correct. So they'll twist it, and some of them are still like, I'll still pick up the phone and have a, friendly chat with them. They've got a job to do, and their job is half the time sensationalising something that actually isn't really worth sensationalising. So there were a couple of things that happened when I was there that weren't massive stories at all, but they were made into quite large stories. You just have to ignore it. The most annoying thing is that you ignore it, but obviously your comms team are briefing you and they're saying, right, this is in this paper, this is kind of what it's saying. I just didn't read it because you would get all consumed by it. But you'd get friends and family going, oh my goodness, have you seen you're in this? And then they'd tweet you the whole article. And I'm like, yes, I know. You don't need to tell me. I know that's happening. So most of the time I ignored it. And there were some quite vicious fans forums within athletics. There's some really quite nasty things. I just ignored it. I'm a great believer you take the money. You've got to take the stuff that comes with it. So I tried to ignore as much as I could. It's probably affected me more since I've gone, because I literally have no right to reply. And so there's been some criticism of me since I've gone. Some of it, I wasn't even at the organisation and they're criticising me for it. So I find that more frustrating, because I don't have a platform to, I suppose, put out a different way of telling a similar story.
Sure. And that kind of brings me on to something that I wanted to talk about in terms of the challenge of leadership today, I suppose, because there are so many different platforms in which I guess you can be sort of spoken about. There's social media where people are going to be talking about you, but then if you think about the various other challenges that leaders face today, a leader kind of has to be clued up on all things from, whether it's something like geopolitics and DEI to media and technology, and it's kind of, I think it's almost impossible to shoehorn all of that expertise into one individual. When you think about a leader today, and obviously thinking about yourself, given that you've been in a leadership role very recently as well, what do you think are sort of some of the key traits that's important for a leader to have?
I think you've got to be really good at recruiting an exec team and being able to delegate those real specific skill sets that you don't have. What a good leader should do is bring all of those people together so they're all travelling in the same direction and they all understand what their goals are. But you have to be able to let go and let experts do their thing. If they come to you and say, I'm torn between this and this, you're the accountable officer, so then you make the decision, but you have to let those experts do their job. The challenge is for a CEO running a sport now, even in the time, I took over 2015, so it's not that long ago. Edie and I wouldn't have been top on, as a CEO, that even just that short time ago, trans athletes, that wouldn't have been on there. The amount of governance now, the amount of stuff involved in safeguarding and the cases and the complexity and nature of cases, all that kind of thing, CEOs, even 10 years ago, wouldn't have been expected to even have within their portfolio. So the challenge really for me is managing something that is a sports organisation, which is a complex business in itself. You run an events business, you run a commercial business, you run a participation business, you run a high performance business. They are separate entities. You're running those, and now you've got all these other things. And that's very difficult, because then if you want the experts to help you through that, most sports, unless they're the big professional sports, don't have the money to fund those experts. So half the time it comes back to the CEO, especially in smaller sports. You'll have the CEO doing all of that. It's impossible. And sport, nowadays people think it will fix everything. And you can't fix everything. So they are huge jobs. And I think you'll see in the industry now, I've been approached for a few CEO roles. I wouldn't go back. And I loved my time, but I just don't think I'd go back. And, I've seen a couple of other really good CEOs who've left and have just gone, I don't think I want to go back. I'd run a club or a league or something like that, but would I run a governing body again? I don't think I would, no.
Sure, that's interesting. And so what would your advice be then for leaders today? Because, it doesn't, the picture you painted there, it makes it sound a little less attractive. But what I suppose for those people who are sort of still aspiring for those leadership roles, you said yourself, not necessarily in the in the governing body side of it. But I suppose, yeah, anyone looking at a leadership role, what would your sort of advice be to them as they're sort of like embarking on that path?
I don't want to sound negative because it's been the best career anybody could have ever had. You know, I've had the most fantastic life on the back of a sports career. So I wouldn't put anybody off. Please don't think that. I think my best advice is ignore the criticism, because that will destroy you. Put great people around you, really, really good, knowledgeable people around you. If you can't afford them full time, bring them in on an ad hoc basis to help you. But it's still the best industry. You know, to sit in a stand and watch an England team win a gold medal and you've been part of it. I know you're not a player and you're not part of the performance, but to be one of the sports administrators that made that happen, I cannot tell you what that feels like. It's like when a manager says, would you have preferred to play or manage that team? And they've got as much joy out of managing it. To be a CEO of an organisation that wins a historic medal, or you watch your athletes compete at an Olympics or a Paralympics and they win a medal, it's an unbelievable feeling. So please don't let me put anybody off. My advice is make sure you surround yourself with people that can do that stuff that will weigh you down rather than you doing the brill stuff.
Sure. And before I let you go, Jo, it'd be remiss of me not to ask. I know you mentioned there you wouldn't go back into the governing body side of things, but what is next for you? Have you kind of considered your next steps? Do you think you'd go back into a top sporting role if given the opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, I've always wanted to go running a football club. That might be quite good fun. Leagues interest me, but I am at the moment really enjoying doing my own thing. So I'm just, I've been working for myself for a while. I was made a granny through COVID, so I have 2 grandbabies that I have on a Friday. So unless it's a 4-day-a-week job, I can't do it anyway because I'm not giving up time with those grandbabies. And I'd like to do some non-exec work. I'd really like to go back into an organisation, but potentially as a non-exec to use my experience. So, yeah, and mentoring. I do love mentoring young women. So I'm still really busy, just not as a CEO of an NGB.
Sure, perfect. Well, we wish you luck with it. And Jo, thanks so much for chatting to us. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Really nice to see you.